Good morning and a very happy 2022 to you from Malcolm Duncan here in County Down. Welcome to our continued journey through the book of Ecclesiastes. To be honest, this morning, I couldn't remember whether I'd said that I was going to broadcast today or not. So I thought best to take the opportunity to share with you and to be together for a few moments anyway. Now, you may hear a cold in my voice. Do not worry, I do not have COVID. I've done LFT tests every day, PCR tests and all kinds of things. I simply have a bug that our grandson had when he came to stay with us over Christmas, and both Debbie and I have caught that. In fact, Debbie is very unwell and may need to be hospitalised with it because it's triggered quite a severe asthma attack for her. So your prayers for her would be very much appreciated this morning. But a very good morning to you. I pray that you have had a good Christmas and New Year season. If it's been a tough one, I pray that you've known God's grace and strength in it, and that you're aware of his presence and of his mercy. I want to take a few moments to continue our journey through the book of Ecclesiastes and invite you just to read some of it with me. Now, I am also aware, because one of the regular attendees at this space sent me a lovely message over Christmas thanking me for the ministry here, that I've actually missed out a few verses earlier on in the book by mistake. In my scheduling, I thought I had done them and I hadn't, so I will return to them and do them in the next few weeks. But I'll probably do it as a separate broadcast to the Sunday morning and then just point you to it so that you know where it is. And we can continue our journey through Ecclesiastes together. So we're going to read from Ecclesiastes chapter 7, and we're going to read from verse 15 down to the end of verse 22. And as we do so, you'll see that this is challenging reading this morning. I read from the New Revised Standard Version, as you know. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, from verses 15 down to verse 22. In my vain life, I have seen everything. There are righteous people who perish in their righteousness, and there are wicked people who prolong their life in their evil doing. Do not be too righteous, and do not act too wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Do not be too wicked, and do not be a fool. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you should take hold of the one without letting go of the other. For the one who fears God shall succeed with both. Wisdom gives strength to the wise more than 10 rulers that are in a city. Surely there is no one on earth so righteous as to do good without ever sinning. Do not give heed to everything that people say, or you may hear your servant cursing you. Your heart knows that many times you have yourself cursed others. God always blesses the public reading of his inspired and his infallible word. Well, what do you make of those verses? If you believe them to be God's inspired word, which I do they not contradict the whole message of the scriptures, that we are to seek righteousness and pursue it, that we are to shun evil, that we are to flee wickedness, that we are to run away from unrighteousness? Well, of course they do. And it's why you have to really take time to think about what Solomon, who I think wrote Ecclesiastes, is doing in this book. And as I have said many times in our journey together through this ancient book of wisdom, it's important to remember the mindset that Solomon is stepping into and occupying as he offers these words. The book of Proverbs, which is also probably written by Solomon, contains many proverbs that are wise and full of strength and grace, but also it's a challenging book to read if you read it carefully. Here, I think the key to understanding it, particularly verses 15 to 22, I'll come to verses 23 to 29 next week, is understanding that Solomon is occupying the mindset of a self-righteous, self-justified, religious person here. So he's exploring their point of view. He's not necessarily saying this is God's point of view. And when you read through verses 15 to 22, you discover several pithy proverbs that are put one after the other. Let's go through them. Excuse me 1 second. The first one is verse 15. In my vain life, I have everything. I have seen everything. There are righteous people who perish in their righteousness, and there are wicked people who prolong their life in their evil doing. Well, of course, that is true. The Bible is full of questions like, why do the wicked prosper, Lord? Why do the righteous suffer? The book of Habakkuk is an exposition of those two questions from beginning to end. So what Solomon does here is say, material blessing, physical prosperity, and long life are not automatically evidence that God approves of your lifestyle. Now, of course, they are blessings from God, and there's a mystery in why God blesses the righteous and the unrighteous, but they are not necessarily evidence that God approves of your choices, that God has approved of a person's lifestyle. So verse 15 gives us this head-on challenge that in the world the righteous suffer and the unrighteous prosper. Again, it's not automatic that the righteous suffer and the unrighteous prosper, but what we are reminded about in these verses is that whether 2022 holds great blessing for you or holds great challenge for you, the blessing or the challenge themselves are not evidence of God's favour per se on your choices and your decisions. Instead, they are parts of life. God pours out his grace upon the righteous and the unrighteous. The rain falls upon the just and the unjust, as Matthew's Gospel tells us. It's a doctrine called common grace, that God graces us and blesses us in so many different ways. Not necessarily just because we are believers, although he also does that. But here, the key is in the first few words, in my vain life. Solomon is occupying this perspective of self-righteousness, of being able to make his way to God and make everything fit. And he says, if that's the lifestyle that you have, if that's the worldview that you have, then one of the fundamental questions that you face is the question of why the righteous suffer and the unrighteous prosper. And that's true. That's true. Verse 16, do not be too, these are the verses that I think are very challenging. Verse 16 and 17 and 18 particularly. Do not be too righteous and do not act too wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Do not be too wicked and do not be a fool. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you should take hold of the one without letting go of the other. For the one who fears God shall succeed with both. So there are three sets in verse 15, 16, 16, 17 and 18. There are three sets of comparisons here. Righteousness and wisdom in verse 16. Wickedness and being foolish in verse 17. And holding on to both in verse 18. And what, again, you need to remember is that Solomon is occupying this worldview of critiquing the religious life. And of course, if you think about it, the religious person who doesn't root their lives in grace, doesn't root their lives in a relationship with God, but rather in rules and regulations and in self-justification, will see evil as an irrelevance or as a minor issue and righteousness as a minor issue. I don't know those of you in the UK that if you ever watched Lark Rise to Candleford, but Dorcas, one of the main, I think her name was Dorcas, the postmistress anyway, would often take a bit of cake or say something nasty or do something that she shouldn't. And then she'd smile and say, it is my one weakness. You know, the self-righteous life will justify itself as often as possible, will justify itself as often as possible, and will always aim for a middle-of-the-road kind of existence. And that's what Solomon is saying here. If your worldview is one of religiosity, of one of self-reliance, and believing that you can justify yourself, that you deserve God's grace and favour somehow, then you're always going to be this person who's right in the middle of the road. Of course, it's not true. And you begin to see Solomon opening up that argument in verse 18 and 19. So go to verse 19, for example. Wisdom gives strength to the wise more than 10 rulers that are in a city. So after having done this little critique of the religious life, he turns his attention to two or three key areas. And the first one is, whatever you do, you need wisdom. Not just knowledge, but wisdom. Knowledge is knowing stuff. Wisdom is knowing what to do with stuff, knowing what to do with what you know. And he says, wisdom is a deeply important aspect of a fruitful and a prosperous life. It's better than the rulers of 10 cities. It's better than wealth. It's better than riches. And remember, if this was written by Solomon, then it was Solomon himself who, when asked by God when he became king what gifts he wanted, said, please give me the gift of wisdom. Then in verse 20 we read, surely there is no one on earth through righteousness to do good without ever sinning. And what you see here is Solomon beginning to press into, again, the conclusion of this worldview beyond the comfortable one that the religious person holds. So he says in verse 19, wisdom is what you need above everything else. In verse 20 he says, well, is there anybody good? A typical Jewish way of probing a question is with a question. Surely, he says, there's no one so good that they could claim to be perfect. Surely we all sin. And that sits at the heart of the gospel. That sits at the heart of the assessment of the human condition that Jesus brings, that Paul brings, that Habakkuk brings, that the whole of the Bible brings, that none of us is perfect. None of us gets it right all the time, and therefore we need an external help. We need someone who will bring us hope, because we cannot solve our own challenges. And then in verses 21 and 22, which I think is really interesting, given what he said in verses 15 to 18, he says, do not give heed to everything that people say. Does he mean even the worldviews of the religious need to be taken with a pinch of salt? Well, maybe. Do not give heed to everything that people say, or you may hear your servant cursing you, and your heart knows that many times you have yourself cursed others. So he finishes this section really by saying, when we look at ourselves, we need to learn what to do with criticism and praise. We need to learn what to do with the things that people say about us. I know personally that is one of the most important lessons I've learned as a Christian and as a pastor, particularly as a pastor. If I got up every day and based my decisions and actions on what people said about me, I wouldn't get out of bed. 2021's been a pretty tough year for many of us. I'll be talking a little bit about this later in our own 10:30 a.m. service. It's been a tough year for me. I've felt the sting of criticism from people. I've felt the heat of praise, and taking what other people say about you too seriously is always a challenging thing that you need to navigate. Be careful this morning as you enter 2022 that you don't allow yourself to become a man pleaser or a person pleaser. Don't live your life to gain the approval of the people around you. Don't live your life so that they think you're great. I've worked with people over the years as a pastor who feel that if you visit someone, they have to visit them. If you call them, they have to call them. If you preach a good sermon, then they have to preach a better one. And in the end, it's a destructive force, It doesn't help them and it doesn't help you. Thankfully, at Dundonald, that isn't part of our dynamic. I'm grateful to God for that. But be careful, whether you're a manager or a leader or a parent, whatever you are, be careful that you don't allow yourself to be taken too seriously by all of the, don't take yourself too seriously by all of the things that people say to you or about you. And I think it's interesting that Solomon ends this section of Ecclesiastes with these words, because he's now beginning to move toward really exposing the heart of what he wants to say. And from verse 23 on, which we'll look at next week, he says, well, here's my perspective. Here's what I think. I have occupied wisdom and I've sought to understand what life is all about. And here's what I think it is. So, as you go into 2022, go into it with a sense of Christ's presence with you. Go into it letting Christ's voice be the one that is louder than everybody else's. Go into it perhaps with me laying your disappointments and your struggles at the feet of Jesus. Bring everything of 2021 to him this morning. The things that have gone well and the things that have not gone so well. The areas where you got it right and the areas where you think you maybe didn't. Exercise a bit of reflection over the next few days and say to the Lord, help me to stay focused on you. Help me to grow in wisdom. Help me to grow in my love of truth and of righteousness. And help me to pursue your justice. And help me to remember that I'm a broken woman, I'm a broken man, and I need your grace and your mercy. But also, oh, sisters and brothers, also above everything, pray this, Lord, help me to remember that your grace is sufficient for my need. That there is nothing that I will face in 2022 that I have to face alone. Because you are there. You are always there. And your love remains constant in Christ. And I will look to him. God bless you. Thanks for joining me this morning. I will be in Dundonald at the earlier time this morning of 10:30, not 11. We're meeting at 10:30 for a shorter service, and there's no service this evening. And then we're back to our normal midweek activity this week on Wednesday night. The prayer meeting is on Tuesday at midday. We're back. The office opens again on Monday. I beg your pardon, on Tuesday, the 4th of July. I'm talking nonsense, the 4th of January. Thank you so much for being here today. May God richly bless you. Remember, if you're a night prayer member, that's also meeting tomorrow night at 9:30. And I'll be talking to you about the rhythm of that moving forward. It's great to have you. God bless you, and thanks for being with me today.